Today's daf is Menachos daf Nuntes, and we are at the top of daf Nuntes Amud Aleph, the Mishnah. So we know that the three key ingredients of every carbon mincha were flour, levina, and shemen. Stating that, Zok the Mishnah, yesh te'unoi shemen u'levina. There was some menachos that required, in addition to the soiles, shemen and levina. Shemen v'loy levina. However, there were also menachos that required shemen as a second ingredient, but not levina. Levina v'loy shemen. There were those that required levina but not shemen. And then finally, there was a fourth category that had only soiles. In other words, loy levina v'loy shemen. Zok the Mishnah, ve'elu tunei shemen u'levina. The following were the menachos that required shemen and levina. Minchas hasoilas, v'hamachavas, v'marcheshes, v'hachalos, v'harakikin. Those are two types of mincha mafitanus. Minchas koyan and minchas koyan mashiach, minchas evik chave, minchas noshim, and minchas ha'omer. And those make up the first category, the menachos that are tu'unoi shemen u'levina. Minchas nesachim, says the Mishnah, tu'unoi shemen ve'ein tu'unoi levina. That's the one example of the second category. So what's a mincha that needs shemen but no levina? That's the minchas nesachim. That's the mincha that came along with many of the karbanos that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Lechem hapanim was also a mincha. It was ta'un levina, ve'ein ta'un shemen. The shnei beziche levina were matter the lechem hapanim. But there was no shemen that came along with the lechem hapanim. Thus, that's the one example of the third category. And finally, shtei halechem, u'minchas choite, u'minchas kanois, those are examples of a mincha that's ein tu'unin, loy shemen, v'loy levina. Incidentally, this Mishnah is mentioned in Nedarim Daf Beis. So it comes up in the Yeshiva Shableter. Why Nedarim Daf Beis? Because Mishnah over there has a whole list of examples where the Mishnah will mention a group of things and then it'll explain it. Sometimes it explains Rishon, and Achron, and sometimes it explains Achron Rishon and Rishon Achron. So, for example, this Mishnah started with four categories: Yesh tu'unoi shemen u'levina, shemen v'loy levina, levina v'loy shemen, loy levina v'loy shemen. And then when the Mishnah explained it, first it explained the first category, then we had an example, the second, the third, and the fourth. But there are many Mishnayos where it's not that way. For example, b'meh madlikin u'b'meh ein madlikin, and then the Mishnah says ein madlikin. We go backwards. B'meh toimnim u'b'meh ein toimnim, b'meh isha yoytza, and the Gemara asks the kasha, why sometimes after mentioning these groups do we explain the first group first, and sometimes we work backwards? And the Gemara suggested a few different possibilities, and the ikar teretz of the Gemara is elo lav dafka zimnin mefarish ahud pasach bereisha and zimnin ahud salik mefarish bereisha. The bottom line is this Mishnah is an example of where you have four categories, and we explain the first one first, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Either way, Amar Papa said kol heicha de tanan eser tanan. So the first category that was mentioned in the Mishnah were the menachos that are tu'unoi shemen u'levina, and the Mishnah gave a whole list. What was the list? Minchas hasoiles, v'machvas, v'marcheshes, all the way up to minchas ha'omer. Says Rav Papa that if you count it, you should know it's 10. And not just that, every time you find a list of menachos that are similar to this list, you should know there should be 10 menachos in this list. So this Mishnah is talking about the menachos that require shemen u'levina, but this category comes up in other contexts as well, and says Rav Papa kol heicha de tanan. Every single time you have this list, you should know it's tanan. What does it mean to say? Rab Shimon said that the minchas mafitaner, which was a certain type of mincha that will be described in detail later in the Masechta, can come mechza chalois and mechza rakikim. According to Rab Shimon, there would be 11, because the Mishnah mentioned chalois and rakikim. Chalois is one, rakikin is another. And they're both examples of a mincha mafitaner. According to Rab Shimon, there's really three types of mincha mafitaner. You have one that came from chalois, one that came from Rikikin, and one that was Mechza Chalis and Mechza Rikikin. So according to Rab Shimon, it would be 11. Kamash Malon Delay. There's another Masnisan Delay Rab Shimon. So one of the themes of Masechtas Menachos, Masnisan Delay Rab Shimon, this is another example where this Stam Mishnah Rav Papa said the number's 10, it's not 11, because late Rab Shimon, it would really come out, it would be 11. Zok the Gemara Tanu Rabbanon, the Pasuk says, V'nosata oleh Shemen, V'samta oleh Levoina Minchahi. So the Pasuk is describing a carbon mincha, and the Pasuk says, how do you prepare the mincha? Number one, the nasato oleh Hashem. Number two, v'samto oleh levaina. So there should be Shem and there should be levaina, and then the pasuk concludes mincha. Now Rashi says this pasuk b'minchas ha'omer kai is describing a specific type of mincha. That's the minchas ha'omer that was brought Tes Zayin Nisan. It's the mincha that was mater chadash. It was mater the tfuah hachadash. Zok the Gemara a braysa. V'nasato oleh Hashem oleh v'oleh lechem upon Hashem. The word oleh is coming to be memayit that it's only oleh on the minchas ha'omer that there was shemen. However, the lechem Aponim, although it too was a mincha, it didn't have shemen. Sheyachol, because really you would have thought Valei Dinu. Man minchas nesachin sheidu tuna levaina tuna shemen. Madach the minchas nesachin, which didn't have levaina. It was the example in the Mishnah of a mincha that needs shemen and no levaina. So the minchas nesachin had no levaina. Still, it was tuna shemen. Lechem Aponim shetan levaina. The lechem avoina that panim that does need lavoina, din shatan shemen. Certainly, it should need shemen. Talmud loymar oleo. That's why the Torah says v'nasato oleo shemen on the mincha sa'omer the shemen, as opposed to a different type of mincha. Which mincha are we being memayit? The lechem aponim that oleo shemen v'loya lechem aponim shemen. Pasuk continues and says, "V'samta oleo lavoina." Here too we have a diak. What's the diak? Oleo lavoina v'loya mincha sasachem lavoina. That the minchas ha'omer requires levaina. However, the minchas ha'sachem no levaina. Sheyochav ali dinu. Same kalbachem. Ma lechem aponim she'neton shemen ton levaina. Ma lechem aponim that has no shemen has levaina. Minchas nesachem shetuna shemen eno din shetuna levaina. Talmud loymar oleo levaina v'loya minchas nesachem levaina. In other words, in the Mishnah we saw that there was a category of a mincha that needed shemen but no levaina, and then there was a category of a mincha that had levaina no shemen. What was levaina and no shemen? That's the lechem aponim. What's shemen and no levaina? That's the minchas hasachem. How do I know that? I know that from a pasuk in the Torah. It says v'nasata oleha shemen v'samta oleha levaina in the parsha of minchas ha'omer. Oleha shemen is coming to be memayit lechem aponim. Oleha levaina is coming to be memayit minchas hasachem. Mincha, that's the end of the pasuk. Minchas the rabbis mincha shmini levaina. That the mincha that was brought b'shmini lemeluim, it needed levaina. When it says the word he, lahoitzi shtei halechem, that's referring to the shtei halechem. Shlayitanu loy shemen v'loy levaina. The lechem shtei halechem had no shemen and had no levaina. So the Gemara is going to go through this brayso line by line. So the first halacha of the brayso was it says v'nasato oleh shemen by the minchas ha'omer, and we learn from there oleh shemen v'loy lechem aponim shemen. Aim afraid the Gemara oleh shemen v'loy minchas kayanim shemen. How do you know that oleh is coming to be memayit that there's no din shemen by the lechem aponim? Maybe it's coming to be memayit minchas kayanim. Now Rashi says there's no reason to assume that the pasuk's being memayit minchas koyanim per se. But the base of the Gemara's kasha is that really any mincha where the Torah doesn't say mefurish needs shemen, in theory may be the mincha that the pasuk is referring to when it says oleho regarding the minchas ha'omer as opposed to others. In fact, Rashi says that the Gemara could have mentioned minchas noshim and minchas gerim, other menachos that the Torah talks about and doesn't have any mention of shemen. Rashi's lashon is v'chad minayunaka. We're just picking one of them. Point is mehecha teisi. Where do you see in v'nasata oleh shemen oleh v'oleh lechem aponim? Maybe it's oleh v'oleh minchas kayanim. Maybe it's oleh v'oleh minchas nashim v'oleh minchas geirim. Either way, as I freak the Gemara says that when mistaber minchas kayanim habalei lebur. No, it's mistaber that just like there's a din shemen by a regular mincha and there's a shemen by the minchas ha'omer, there's probably shemen by the minchas kayanim as well. And the reason is because there are many similarities, argues the Gemara, between the minchas kayanim and the minchas ha'omer. What are the similarities? Number one, isarin, the shear of how much soilus you had to have was the same for the minchas omer as it was for the minchas koyanim. Additionally, kli, they both required lisha inside a kli sharis. Chutz, they were both prepared in the azara. Vitsura, they both have a psolina. Hagasha, they both had a mitzvah of hagasha. Ve'ishim, and they were both put on the mizbech. And this is in contrast to the lechem aponim. The lechem aponim didn't have a shear isarin. Lechem aponim was 12 breads. It was a whole different shear. Additionally, there was no kli sharis where you did the lisha for the lechem aponim. Chutz, it wasn't prepared in the azara. It was prepared in the heichel. There was no psolina on the lechem aponim. It sat on the shulchan for a week. Hagasha, there was no hagasha of ishim. It never went on the mizbech. So the bottom line is that you have all these similarities between the minchas koyanim and the minchas ha'omer. Thus, it's mistaber that if you're going to be mema'it something from the minchas ha'omer, you'll be mistaber the thing that's less similar. Lechem aponim is less similar to the minchas ha'omer than is the minchas koyanim. But the Gemara says, Adarabba, I could show you a whole bunch of similarities that the lechem aponim has to the minchas ha'omer that the minchas koyanim doesn't have. Lechem aponim havalei l'buye shekein tzibura. Number one, carbon sibur. The lechem aponim was a carbon sibur, just like the minchas ha'omer was. Chayva, they were both obligations. Minchas kayanim is if a kayan wants to bring a mincha. Lechem aponim was something that had to be brought. The minchas ha'omer was something that had to be brought. Tameh, tumud hutra b'tzibur, tumud chuya b'tzibur. That's only true for a carbon sibur. So the lechem aponim was babatuma. The minchas ha'omer was babatuma, but minchas kayanim is not babatuma. The achol, they both were eaten. Pigula, they're both shayich to pigul and b'shabata. They were both teicha Shabbos again because it's a carbon tzibur, and that's all in contrast to the minchas koyanim. Minchas koyanim is not tzibura; it's not a minchas yachid. it's a minchas yachid. Chayva, there's no obligation to bring it. Because it's a carbon yachid, it's not babetoma. It wasn't eaten. The minchas kohen had to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. Therefore, there's no pegel, and b'Shabbos it couldn't have been brought on Shabbos either. Either way, so it says the Gemara mehechetesi. When it says alel by the minchas oimer, it means to be memayit shtei alechem. That there's no shemen by the shtei alechem. Maybe it's coming to be memayit the minchas oimer, says the Gemara. So maybe it's coming to be memayit the minchas kohenim, says the Gemara mistabra nefesh. That being when the Torah mentions the halacha of shemen, the classic mincha that has shemen and has levoino, the Torah says nefesh ki sakriv korban mincha. Nefesh is a lashon yachid, and it seems to suggest that every yachid that brings a carbon has shemen. So it's actually mistaber that if we have a miyut now, that there's a certain mincha that doesn't have the din shemen, it's not describing a classic minchas yachid. Because the classic minchas yachid would seem to have a din shemen. Where would it seem to be that way? From the pasuk, v'nefesh kisa'at k'rib mincha. Thus, if I have a pasuk that's being memayit aleh, it's presumably being memayit, not a carbon yachid, but rather a carbon sibur. What's the carbon sibur? The lechem aponim. Amamar. This next part of the brayso, aleh levoino v'loy al minchas nesachon levoino. So it said again, v'nasata aleh shemen v'samta aleh levoino. And what is aleh levoino coming to be memayit? That there was a din levoino by the minchas ha'omer. However, there was no levoino by the minchas nesachon. Afraid the Gemara, ema aleh. Minchas kohenim in the same kasha. How do you know it's coming to be memayit? Maybe it's coming to be memayit minchas kohenim mechetesi the minchas nesachim. And again, we have no reason to assume minchas kohenim. Could have said minchas nashim, etc. Rashi says again v'chada minayu naket. We just mean to give one example. How do you know you're coming to be memayit minchas nesachim? Maybe it's coming to be memayit the minchas, some other mincha that it doesn't have a din levoino. So the Gemara says mistaber minchas kohen have a level. It's mistaber that minchas kohenim has a din levoino just like the minchas oimer shekain, because there are many similarities between the minchas koyanim and the minchas ha'omer that the minchas nesachim doesn't have. So it's going to be a slightly different list, because here we need similarities not just between the minchas ha'omer and the minchas koyanim, but we need similarities between the minchas ha'omer and the minchas koyanim that are not shared with the minchas nesachim, right? That's why the list is a little bit different, if you're keeping cheshbon. And what are those similarities? Shekain bolu isarim bolu b'loig. Number one, it's an isarin of soilas that's mixed together with a loig of shemen. Mugash, they both had to go on the mizbech. And biglal etzem, they were both brought on their own account. The minchas ha'omer was brought on its own account, and the minchas koyanim was brought on its own account, as opposed to the minchas nesachim that wasn't in isarim bolu b'loig. It also wasn't mugash. There was no hagasha. Additionally, it wasn't brought on its own account. It came together. It was an ancillary of a regular carbon. But the Gemara says, the rabbi minchas nesachim have a little. I could show you similarities that the minchas nesachim has with the minchas ha'omer that's not shared with the minchas koyanim. Shekain tzibura. They're both a carbon tzibur. The minchas nesachim came with the carbonoi tzibur. So it's a carbon tzibur, just like the minchas ha'omer is. Chayva, you had to bring it. Ve'itmi, you have the halachas of Tumah Hutra and Tumah Tchuya b'tzibur. And B'Shabbata, they were brought on Shabbos. So Mechetesi says, the Gemara mistabra nefesh. Again, same cheshbon. That being that the pasuk says, v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha, and that mincha is describing a mincha that has in it both shemen and levoina. It's mashma. Every minchas yachid has shemen and has levoina. The minchas kohenim is a minchas yachid, so it's mashma that the minchas kohenim does have levoina. So it's more mistaber to be mema'it from aleha the minchas nesachim, which is not nefesh, it's not a minchas yachid, rather than be mema'it the minchas koyanim. Mincha, the next word of the pasuk was mincha, and we said l'rabbis mincha shmini l'levoina. It's coming to be marba that the mincha that was brought on the shmini l'meluim of Parsha Shmini fame, it had levoina. Says the Gemara ve'emel ha'itzi. Everything till now was a miyut. This is suddenly a riboy. V'nasata oleh shemen, v'loya lechem apan. V'samta oleh levoina, v'loya minchas nesachim. Mincha l'rabbis. Why l'rabbis? Maybe l'haitzi. Maybe it's coming to tell me that the mincha that was brought on the Shmini l'meluim did not have. Says the Gemara, Hi ma, yamr b'shleim l'rabbi shapir. B'shleim, if it's coming to be marba, I understand why you need a pasuk to be marba. Yamr l'haitzi, l'amali, shami dairis l'yalfina. And we had this last week. L'chura, in svara, there'd be no way to learn a din shemen or levoina by the carbon mincha that was brought on the Shmini l'meluim from the fact that every mincha has a halacha of levoina because shah midairos la yalfinan. So to tell me a pasuk lo haitzi I don't need, because that presupposes that without a miyut I would think there's a din levaina. Kamash Malana Miut, that is no Levaina. So the Gemara, Cheshbon, it's not true. Without a pasuk, I would not know it in Levaina. Because the whole basis to say Levaina is because the classic mincha has Levaina. The nefesh ki sakri karbe mincha, there's halacha, v'samto ala Levaina. But that's only referring to a mincha of dairis. Mechatese a mincha of shah. Kamash Malan, that's why it's mistaber, says the Gemara, that if there's a pasuk, the pasuk is coming l'rabbis, it's not coming l'haitzim. Now the obvious question is that why do I even need a pasuk to tell me what the halacha was for the mincha that was brought b'shmini l'meluim? I mean, al zen nemar madahava hava, right? I mean, this is whatever happened already happened. So the Rishonim struggle with it a little bit. I was thinking we had a Gemara last week or 2 weeks ago where the Gemara said that by Bayesheni they played over the Shmini L'Meluim and the Karbonos that the Gemara, when it was describing some of the very sasum psukim and Sefer Yecheskel. So one of the psukim over there, the Gemara says, is referring to the Shmini L'Meluim, and that Ezra brought, when they inaugurated Bayesheni, the same Karbonos that were brought to Shmini L'Meluim. So it comes out that what happened with Shmini L'Meluim did have a nafkamina l'dairis. It was Negeya, the Beis HaMikdash of Ezra. Ezra had to know what to do. It's all based on this pasuk. It's not Madahava Hava. If it was a one-time event, now it's Kodesh Shah, the Gemara says, but that doesn't mean it only happened once. If it was never going to happen again, it's a good kasha, but once you find already that it played itself out again, so Ezra, how was Ezra supposed to know what to do? So this mincha that I'm going to bring, presumably there was a mincha that he brought. So is the mincha going to have levainos or not going to have levainos? That's this pasuk mincha, that if at any point in the future Parsha Shmini would have to chazes itself over, you would know exactly what you're supposed to do. Regardless, the last word of the pasuk is he, and that teaches me a halacha regarding the shtei halechem, the topic of daf nun ches, shelo yitanu loy shemen v'loy levaina. That the shtei halechem, although it's a mincha, but at the same time there's no shemen and there's no levaina. Fragt the Gemara again, ve'emaloitzi minchas koyanim, some drittamul. So the Gemara is really not letting up. Says the Gemara, maybe when it says he, it's coming to be memayit minchas koyanim. So again, v'nasato leho shemen, we thought maybe it's being memayit minchas koyanim. That didn't work. V'samto le levaina, we thought maybe it's coming to be memayit minchas koyanim. That failed as well. But now, a third attempt. Maybe he is coming to tell me that the Minchas Koyanim has no Shemen and no Levaina. Says the Gemara, Mistaber Minchas Koyanim Habalei Levruye. It's Mistaber, the Minchas Koyanim should be Nisrabba, because it's much more similar to the Minchas Omer. Again, that's the context of this pasuk. Than is the Shtei Alechem. Shekein Isaroin. It is Isaroin, like the Minchas Omer. That's the shear. Kli needs Lisha Bekli. Matzah. They were both matzah. The Minchas Omer had to be matzah. Kol HaMenachos were boys matzah. The Minchas Koyanim also had to be matzah. The etzem, they come for themselves. They're not coming along with something else. Hagasha, the Ishim. And this is all in contrast to the Shtei Alechem. The Shtei Alechem is not an Isarin, no Lisha Bekli. It was a matzah. It's one of the two exceptions that the Mishnah mentions in the beginning of the parak that were chamit. The etzem, it didn't come by itself. Came with the kivsei atzeres. Hagasha, there was no hagasha. The ishim, it never went on the mizbeach. But the Gemara says, no, shtei alechem havalei lebuye. I think it makes more sense to be marba the shtei alechem if you want to go down this road. Shekena, this is a long list. Tzibur, it's a carbon tzibur, like the minchas ha'omer as opposed to minchas koyanim. Chayva, therefore it's ba betoma. The achal, it's eaten. As opposed to minchas koyanim that wasn't eaten. Pigol, b'shabbat, it can be brought b'shabbat because it's a carbon tzibur. Mater, it's matter. The Shtei Alechem and the Minchas Omer, as a matter of fact, were extremely similar. They were eerily similar. How so? The purpose of the Minchas Omer was to be matter the Tfuah Chadasha. The purpose of the Shtei Alechem was also to be matter the Tfuah Chadasha in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Minchas Omer was matter the Tfuah Chadasha begvulin. The Shtei Alechem was matter the Tfuah Chadasha in the Mikdash. So they're both matirim. Ba'aretz, they both had to come from Tfuah and Eretz Yisrael. We had this also in some of the Shveri Daf and Obayantif, where it was Mavur, that the 40 years that the Yidden were in the Midbar, they couldn't bring the Shtei Alechem, because the Shtei Alechem had to come from Tfuah. That was in Eretz Yisrael. Bizman, they both have a Zman. The Minchas Omer is Tez Zayin Nisan. The Shtei Alechem had to be brought on Shavuos, as opposed to the Minchas Koyanim, you bring it whenever you want to bring it. And Chadash, they both had to come from the Tfuah Chadash. And says the Gemara, by the way, V'hani Nefishin. This is a much longer list. So if anything, it makes more sense to be Marba the Shtei Alechem and to be Mamait the Minchas Nesachem. So why is it that we're Marba Minchas Koyanim and we're mema'it the shtei halechem? Says the Gemara, mistabra nefesh, same teretz. It's literally the same teretz for all three attempts that the Gemara made. At the end of the day, there's a pasuk that says nefesh ki sakriv mikem mincha. Korban mincha, and that pasuk talks about shemen, it talks about levayna. Nefesh is mashma korban yachid. It sounds like every single minchas yachid has shemen, has levayna. Thus, even though there's three miyutim that theoretically, hypothetically, technically could be coming to be mamayed, different types of gevissa minchas yachids, where the Torah doesn't say before is shemen, it doesn't say before is levayna, but that pasuk of nefesh is mashma that all korbanos yachid, all minchas yachid have a din of shemen, have a din of levayna. So if there's a miyut, it's mistaber that it's coming to be mamayed, not a minchas yachid, it's coming to be mamayed, a minchas tzibor. What were the three miyutim again? The nasata aleha shemen is coming to be mamayed to shteh. The lechem aponim. Lechem aponim was a mincha. It didn't have shemen. It had levayna. It didn't have shemen. It's the example of that Mishnah gives for a mincha that's tu'unois levayna ve'ina tuna shemen. When it says v'samta aleha levayna is coming to be mamayed minchas nesachin. Thus, it is the example in the Mishnah of a mincha that's tu'una shemen, but it's ena tuna levayna. When it says mincha, he too is a memiyat. It's coming to unite the shtei alechem. Shtei alechem had no levayna. The shtei alechem had no shemen. It's one of the three examples that the Mishnah gave of a mincha that has no shemen and no levayna. One of the other two examples, the minchas chayte and the minchas karais. But the point is that all three miyutin are karbanos sivur. Why karbanos sivur? Because it's not mashma that there's any minchas yachid on the planet that doesn't have a din shemen and doesn't have a din levayna. Nefesh ki sakriv karba minchas mashma l'rabbis. Every single nefesh, every yid that comes into the Beis Hamikdash and he wants to give his nefesh, his minchas ani, there's going to be shemen, there's going to be levayna. When you're a minchas chayte, we start already. If it's the tzibur, maybe there's no shemen, maybe there's no levayna. But every single minchas ani had shemen, had levayna. Right? Shemen is significant. It makes the karban mohudar. Levayna, the imayis are called levayna. Rashi says in Chumash. So every single individual nedava that any yachid brought had shemen, had levayna. The three miyutim must be talking about karbanos tzibur, lechem aponim, minchas nesachem, and shtei alechem, respectively. Another Mishnah. V'chayev ala shemen b'fnei atzmoi. V'chayev ala levayna b'fnei atzma. So one of the menachos that had no shemen and no levayna was the minchas chayte. In fact, the Torah says lo yasim aleh shemen v'lo yitein aleh levayna. By the minchas kanois, the Torah says lo yitzaik olav shemen v'lo yitein olav levayna. So clearly, not only is there no din shemen and there's no din levayna, but there's a loisa say lo yasim aleh shemen v'lo yitein olav levayna. Lo yitzaik olav shemen v'lo yitein olav levayna. Says the Gemara. It's for that reason the chayev ala shemen b'fnei atzma. If somebody puts shemen, he's going to be chayev malchus. Not just that. If or you put a shemen, you chayiv malchus for putting shemen. It would have been a havamina that the isser shemen and levayna come together. So if you do both, then there's a chiyuv. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah. V'chayiv al shemen b'fnei atzmei, v'chayiv al levayna b'fnei atzmei. Nosan al shemen pasuk. If you put shemen on a minchas chayte or a minchas kanois, it's gone. There's nothing you can do with this carbon anymore. Levayna, if you put levayna, yul katena, you can remove the levayna. As long as you get all the levayna out, it's okay. Nosan shemen al shiur. If you put shemen on the shiur mincha, you're not over in a loisa say final halacha nosan kli agabi kli. What if you had the minchas chayte, the minchas kenois inside a keli, and you had shemen inside a keli, and the two kelim touched each other by pasla? And of course, is not going to be a reason that it should be pasla. Shemen ve'im some pasla. It says in the Torah, you're not allowed to put shemen on the minchas chayte. What happens if you do it? It's going to be possible. I would think the same should be true for levayna. That being that the Torah says, if you put levayna, it's going to be possible as well. Talmud loimer ki chatas. The pasuk, the same pasuk. Layasam ala shemen v'layitein ala levayna ki chatasi. And the Gemara makes a geshmaka drasha. Ki chatas. That even after you put the levayna, it's still considered a chatas. Yochel af b'shemen. Maybe ki chatas is going back both on shemen and levayna. So whether you put shemen on the minchas chayte, or you put levayna on the minchas chayte, you have this riboy of ki chatas that tells me that even though you didn't follow the steps, still it's going to be kosher. Talmud loy marhi. It says ki chatas. See, chatas is a riboy. He is a miut. When marba something, when ma'id something. When marba that if you put levayna where you weren't supposed to put the levayna, it's still going to be kosher. He is mamai that if you put shemen where you weren't supposed to put shemen, it's going to be possible. Frank the Gemara, the obvious question: How do you know that the riboy is marba levayna and the miut is mamai mayit shemen, maybe the opposite. Maybe the ribu is marbe shemen and the miyut is mayit live. You know, says the Gemara, poislan yibeshemen sheyev shaloykte. Mashnu when sheyev shaloykte. It's common sense. If you put shemen and you mix it together with the soil, there's no way to get the shemen out. So it's mashma that's probably what the Torah means when the Torah says that it's going to be possible. But levayna is physically possible to remove. Being that you physically can remove the levayna, it's mistaber. That's what the Torah meant when it said kechatas, that just because you put it there doesn't matter. Remove it, and everything is going to be okay. Says the Gemara. So the Mishnah had said, Nasan Allah shemen psula levayna yil ketana. So we're dealing with menachos that you're not allowed to put shemen, you're not allowed to put levayna on, stating that there's a chiluk. If you put shemen, the mincha is going to be puzzle. If you put levayna, the Mishnah said yil ketana. You can go ahead and be malakid it. Now notice the Mishnah didn't say kshera. The Mishnah said yil ketana. So Rabbi Barafuna Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Barafuna asked Rabbi Yochanan, Nasan Allah levayna shchuka. What would be if the kohen put levayna on the mincha, but he ground the levayna first? It was levayna shchuka. What's the halacha? What's the shaila? The Mishnah didn't say kshera. The Mishnah said nasan aleh levayna yil ketena. So mishum de'efshel l'lakta. It sounds like the only reason it's okay is because you could taka be malakid it. V'ha lo yefshel l'lakta. But being that this levayna shchuka, it's going to be impossible to be malakid it. You can't differentiate between the silas and the levayna shchuka. So maybe it's going to be possible. Oidoma, or maybe mishum delay mivla. Hanami loy mivla. Maybe the reason levayna is kosher is not because you could be malakid it, but it's because it doesn't intermingle with the silas in the same way that the shemen does. The shemen becomes balua in the silas, as opposed to the levayna does not become balua in the silas. So it could be that's the reason. Now, the Mishnah said yil ketena. That's true, the Mishnah said yil ketena, and that will be, by the way, the Gemara's first tashmat to the shaila, but the Gemara is suggesting that yil ketena is just another way of saying sheira, and the reason it would be kosher is not because you could be malakid it, but because it's not really balua. So if it's not really balua, even if it's shchuka, it's not really balua. You can't be malakid it. That's not the real reason. But the Gemara says tashma. It's not what the Mishnah says. Ulavayna yil ketena. The Mishnah says mefurish that when it comes to nasan ala shem and psula, when it comes to nasan ala lavayna yil ketena. So what does it sound like? It sounds like the only reason it's kosher is because it can be malakid it. But if you can't be malakid, it's going to be possible. The Gemara says dilma chadav oid kamar. Could be the Mishnah gave one of two reasons. Chada deloy mivla. The one reason that it doesn't mention is that it's not balua. V'oid additionally yil ketena. You have to be malakid it. In other words, maybe the real reason that it's kosher by Nasma Levayna was not even mentioned in the Mishnah. Talk about Iker Chasim in our Mishnah. But it could be the main reason is because it's not balua. And that would be true even if it's shchuka, and that's why it's always going to be kosher. When the Mishnah said Yil Katena, it's just another reason for Eidel Ketena. I saw that some explained that the reason the Mishnah would give maybe the other reason is because being that there's a lav when one puts levayna on top of these menachos, so the lav in the Torah is mechayev to go ahead and do a l'tikita. So the l'tikita is something you're going to have to do regardless. So being that you anyways going to have to be malakid it, so and then it's going to be kosher. So the Mishnah just says that anyways being malakid it, so it's not such an issue. So as much as it's not the real reason that it's kosher, because it's kosher even when you can't be malakid it, but it is on some level an ikar reason because this is something that you're inevitably going to do. The bottom line is the Gemara says tashmas. You have no right from the Mishnah. What about from the Brisa? The Brisa said the same thing. Again, it sounds like the reason levayna is kosher is because it's efshal loikta, not because it's not mivla. And if that's the case, by levayna shchukim wouldn't be the case. So the Gemara says hachanami chadav. Here too, you could say it's only one of two reasons, like we explained it a minute ago. Bottom line, my haviyallah. Okay, tachlis. So we have a shaila. Again, what would be if the kohen put levayna shchuka on top of these menachos? The Mishnah said yil ketena. Now you can't be malakid. If the reason it's kosher is because of yil ketena, well now you can't be malakid it. If it's chadavayit kamar, and the real reason is actually not the reason stated in the Mishnah, but rather because of the fact that it's like mivla, so in that situation, it will be kosher. So what's the bottom line? Zok the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, Tanya, it's a Mefurish Brisa. The Brisa says, Minchas Chayte, Minchas Kanois, regarding Minchas Chayte, Minchas Kanois, these are the two menachos that have no shemen and no levayna, shenasan ala levayna, in the event that levayna was put on it, melaket es ha levayna ksher, could do a likita on the levaina, it's going to be kosher. V'im atcha likit levaina. So here's the punchline. What would be if before the likita of the levaina, so before the levaina was taken off, chishev aleh, the kohen had a machshava, bein chutz l'zmani, bein chutz l'mkoymai, whether it was a machshavas pigel of chutz l'zmani, machshavas pigel of chutz l'mkoymai, either way, pasavein by kares. It's going to be pasavein by kares. Now this is a chiddush because chutz l'mkoymai is always pasavein by kares, but chutz l'zmani is always kares. The reason is because that's only true kartzas kosher kachartzas pasal. It has to be a kosher a carbon without the machshavas pickle. But over here, being that the carbon is anyways pasul, and the reason the carbon is anyways pasul is because there's levaina on top of it. So even where it's a machshav of chutz zman, it's going to be pasul fashteitzach, but it's going to be aim by cars. Shaliki levaina asa. But what would be if he took away the levaina and then he was chishev aleh, and then he had the machshava? So chutz m'kaymei pasul aim by cars. In that case, chutz m'kaymei is going to be pasul aim by cars. Chutz l'zmanei, as opposed to chutz l'zmanei, pickle v'chayav and all of cars. If, however, it's chutz l'zmanoi, so then there's going to be a chiyav pigol, and you're going to be chayav kares in the event that you didn't go ahead and you didn't remove the levaina. So then it's in a state of psul, and because it's in a state of psul, so if you have a machshava of chutz l'zmanoi, it's going to be pasul ein by kares. If, however, you removed it, so then already it's not in a state of psul anymore, and being that it's not in a state of psul, so it's for that reason that it's going to be pasul, and there's going to be a chiyav kares, because at this point it's already in a state of kashrus. But what do you see from here? You see from here that as long as the levaina is on top of the mincha, even though it's not balua, it's going to be considered pasul. What's the raya? What do you see from Nachman Yitzchak's Braisa? It's because you see mefurish that a machshav of chutz l'zmanei, once the levaina is on it, is pasul vein by kares. And if that's the case, it means it's a pasul mincha. Now, if you're going to tell me that really anytime you put the levaina on top of the mincha, it's going to be kosher. It's not just yul ketena and then it's going to be kosher, but rather it's always going to be kosher because it's not nivla. So if that's the case, so why is it that if you weren't melakid, it's going to be pasul vein by kares? It should be pig of a chayav and all of kares because it's always a mincha psula. That's a tashma. That's a mefurish raya to one side in the chakira. That the Mishnah and the Braisa are bedafka. So not on shemen in the event that you put shemen psula. Levaina you'll ketena. But if you're not malakid in that case, it's going to be pasul. What's the raya? If you have a machshavas pickle at that point, it would be pasul ve'ein boikars. But the Gemara asks one more kasha, and that is for tahava pach. In the event that the levaina was put on top of the mincha, we should view it as if the shemen was put on top of the mincha, and it should remain pasul forever. And if that's the case, my pasul b'machshava, why is it that the Braisa says that once you malakad the levaina, a machshava chutz l'zmanoi would be pigel v'chayav and all of kares, dachoyhu, l'chayr it's dachoy. And being that it's dachoy, so at that point, it should not be pigel v'chayav and all of cars. What does the Gemara mean? The Gemara means to say that we know there's a psul dachoy. Dachoy means that once something is nitcha from being roy lavoida, at that point it's never going to be roy lavoida. The Gemara's kasha is that being that while the lavoina is on top of the mincha is a problem. So even if you remove it, it should remain a problem. And as it relates to machshavas pigel, why is it that if once you malakad the lavoina, machshava chutz hazman is going to be pigel v'chayav and all of kares? We should say that even if you remove the lavoina, it's still dachoy, and being that it was dachoy, the machshavas pigel shouldn't affect anything. Now, if you take a look at Rashi, and really from the Lashon HaGemara, it's clear the Gemara's kasha is on the Braisa. V'tahavi pach v'amai pasal b'machshava. You would have thought the Gemara would ask the kasha on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Nasan alel levaina yul ketena." Why yul ketena? When the levaina is on it, it's a problem. So even if you're going to be malakid it now, at that point it should be a problem. The answer is that that's not a taina. The reason that's not a taina is because we have a mefurish drasha that the Gemara brought on top of the Yom Tanu Rabbanon la yasim alel shemen vim sham pasol. So we know that there's a drasha that says that as long as the levain is there, it could be a problem. Yeah, I mean, that was the baya of the Gemara that we just went through. But Lamaskana, as long as it's there, it's going to be a problem. But once you malak it, for sure, based on the drasha, we know it's going to be kosher. So klape, the kashrus and the passos of the mincha, the Gemara is not asking it to be a psul dachoy, because the Gemara knows it's Gzeres HaKasiv that already addressed that. What the Gemara is asking is that klape, the halach of kartzas kosher, kartzas pasol, klape that in. There's a halacha that you need that the carbon should be roy lavoid 100% in order for you to be able to effectuate a machshavas pigel. And the Gemara is telling that being that there's a hefts of dachi over here, even though there's a Gzeres HaKasiv that says it's kosher, but hamiyat should be considered any roy lavoida, klape the halachas of pigel. And for the Gemara, Amar Abaya, so Abaya said, I hear, Bachatas Kaya Rachmana. At the end of the day, the Torah refers to a mincha that has lavoina on it. This mincha that's not supposed to have lavoina. The mincha schayte has a chatas. That's the pasuk we mentioned earlier. Le'yasam alei Hashem v'le'itan alei lavoina ki chatasi is chatas karya rachmana even while the lavoina is there. And it's for that reason that the machshavas pigel is going to impact it after you remove the lavoina, that it's going to be pasul and it's going to be a chiyav kares, and we're not going to look at it as dachi. Rav said a different reason. Again, the Gemara is trying to understand now in this brisa. Why is it that if there was lavaina on it, and then you removed the lavaina, now if you have a regular machshavas pigel, it's going to be pigel. L'chayra, you should say once the lavaina was on it, that should make the mincha dachoy. And once it's dachoy, even though now you were already malakit the lavaina, maybe that should change things. So the Gemara is coming from another angle now. You're telling me while the lavaina is on the mincha, it's possible. You can remove the lavaina. If you remove the lavaina, it's definitely going to be okay. The kasha is that once the lavaina being on the mincha made the mincha psula, even if you remove it, it should remain possible because of a psul dichoy. First teretz the Gemara cave was Abaye said it's exeres hakasav chatas kai rachmana. Rav says Amani Chanan Mitzri the less leitchoy. We're going according to Chanan Mitzri who doesn't hold the psul dichoy. Where do you find the Chanan Mitzri doesn't hold the psul dichoy? Tiny we learned to the rise of Chanan Mitzri Eimer. I feel udam because maybe chaveroi shaloi bahagrala. The context over there is the Shnei Seirim that were brought on Yom Kippur. One Sar went Lashem, the other Sar went Lazazan. There was a halacha that both Seirim had to be alive at all times in order for the hakrava of the two respective Seirim to be kosher. What happens if something happens to one of the Seirim? So according to the Chachamim, it's a major problem. Because once something happens to one of the Seirim, you can't just go replace the Sar. Because being that you need both Seirim alive at all times, if something happens to Seir Aleph, Seir Beis automatically is gone. It becomes a psul dichoy. Stating that, Chanan Mitzri says it's not a problem. Afilu dam because, even if you already shechted the Sar Anasa Lifnim, if something happens afterwards to the Sar Mishtalech, maybe Chaveroi, bring a new Sar Mishtalech, Shaloi Bahagrol, you don't make a new Groirol, Umazabilis, he's the Chanan Mitzri, doesn't hold it up psul dichoy. Doesn't hold up psul dichoy. This brisa that's mashma, that the fact that the Lavoina was on top of the Minchas Chayte didn't disqualify the Minchas Chayte is going according to Chanan Mitzri. Rashi, different there is Kol Sheb Yodel Havi Dache. Really, the time of the brisa is not Chanan Mitzri. It's going according to Mandam that holds there is a psul dichoy. But it could be there's no psul dichoy when something is biyade. Where it's biyade to fix the psul, maybe there's no psul dichoy. Amar Rav Ada, Kabas Rav Ashi Mistabra. You're right, Rav Ashi is far. The man Shamalei Disleit Chuyim. Who's the Tana throughout Shas that holds of dichoy? I mean, most Tana hold of dichoy. It's Chanan Mitzri that doesn't hold of dichoy. But which Tana says mefurish psul dichoy? It's Rabbi Yehuda. Tana learned to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Nishbach Adam Yomus HaMishtalech Meis HaMishtalech Yishavich Adam. In the context of the Shnei Seir, if something happens to one, you have to get rid of the other. If something happens to one, right? It goes both ways. So you see, Rabbi Yehuda holds psul dichoy. V'ilu heichad Rabbi Yehuda Tanya. Yet the same Rabbi Yehuda holds another famous Rabbi Yehuda in Kachim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kois Hayim Amal Medam Taroibes V'Zorkes Rik Achas Keneged Ayisayt. The context is Erev Pesach when they brought the Karbanos Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda was worried that maybe the Kohanim's reason, hey, maybe the dam fell out of one of the koises. He said, after you're done with all the Karbanos Pesach, take a kois echad, do the zrika on the mizbeach, like this will be yotzah. In the event that somebody's dam never made it onto the mizbech. What's the kasha? If you worry that the dam fell on the floor, and at that point it wasn't in the klishar, is ready to do zrika, why don't you say it's dachoy at that point? How does Rabbi Yehuda allow you later to clean up this mess? Once the mess happened, shouldn't that be a svara to say dachoy? The teretz is it's biyadei l'sake. So you see the svara biyadei l'sake. That's Rav Ada said Kavas Rav Ashi Mistabra, because who's the Tana Chas that holds dachi? It's always Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda Masechtas Yuma. I have another Rabbi Yehuda Masechtas Psachim, all kachim related. Yuma has kachim, Psachim has kachim. So Rabbi Yehuda in Yuma regarding the Shnei Seirim holds of dichoy. Yet Rabbi Yehuda Psachim regarding the Karban Pesach says it's okay even if something happened right now. The dam is not in a state where you could do zrika. It doesn't make a dachi. Why? Because it's biyadei. You can always pick it up and fix it. Dachi is a problem where it wasn't biyadcha to fix it. You would have to rely on something else for it to be fixed. But if it's biyadcha to fix it, biyadei is always a svara. Right? It comes up Rashi in Daf Beis. It comes up in many sugis in Shas. There's a svara called biyadei. It's like a migu type idea. But there's a concept of biyadei, right? So says Rav Ada, Rav Yehuda, I say clearly biyadei. Bottom line, there's three truths into this kash. If there's lavaina on top of the minchas chayte, it's a problem. if you remove the levayna, the price is clear, then everything is good to go. Kasha is, let it be dachoy. Why do you say psul dichoy? 3 terutzim. Abaye said, chatas kayi rachman. At the end of the day, the Torah called it a chatas. So you see, it's xeris hakasa. Rava said, we're going according to Madam that doesn't hold up psul dichoy, that's Chanan HaMitzri. And Rav Ashi said, being that it's biyada, you could always remove the levayna, there's a svar of kosha biyadai, loy havi dachoy exhale. So, this morning, we learned Daf Nun Ches, and the Gemara brought a machlokes Abaye v'Rava regarding the loisaseh in the Torah of kichol sa'ar v'chol devash loisaktiru mimenu ishal Hashem. The Gemara brought a brisa that says the word ki kol sa'ar, ki kol devash is coming to be marba even pachas mikashir. So kol sa'ar is the rabbi's pachas mikashir. Kol devash is the rabbi's pachas mikashir. The question is, what is the shir? I was on machlokes Abaye v'Rava. Abaye said the shir is even pachas mikazayis. That if somebody is makder pachas mikazayis sar, pachas mikazayis of devash, he's going to be over the isser of kichol sa'ar, the chol devash loisaktir v'menu ishal Hashem. Rava said no, that pachas mikashir means kazayis. Pachas mikoimetz, but at the end of the day, it still has to be kazayis. So according to Abaya, if somebody's makder pachas mikazayis, the halacha is he's over the iser of kichol so v'chol devash. According to Rava, if someone is makder pachas mikazayis, he's not going to be over the iser. There's a brisa that says pachas mikashir. Pachas mikashir means pachas mikoimetz, because when you're talking about a mincha and you're discussing shir, what you're thinking is in terms of koimetz. Rava holds that the standard koimetz has shnei zeisim. Thus, could be the riboy was to be marba, half of the standard shir, which is at the very least a kazayas. Abaya held the standard koimetz had less than shnei zeisim. Thus, if we mean marba, half of that, it's going to be a pachas mikazayas. The bottom line is, according to Abaya, if you makter less than a kazayas of sar and vash, you're over the iser. According to Rava, if you makter less than a kazayas of sar and vash, you're not going to be over the iser. The Rambam in Hilchas Yisurei Mizbeach, Perekei Halacha Aleph, brings the halach. Says the Rambam, so oir udvash asurim legabe ha-mizbeach. So oir and dvash are asur to make contact with the mizbeach. The isuram bekol sheheh. And this isur is even bekolshu. Shenemar kichol sa'ar b'chol devash lo yisaktiru v'goyim. The Rambam says that it's also to put soir in vash. And this isur is not only a shir, you're over even if it's a kolshu. Fake the kesef mishnah. L'chayr the Rambam passing like Abaye. So machlokes Abaye v'Rav in the Gemara. Abaye says kol sa'ar is l'rabos pachas mikashir, which means what? Even pachas mikazayis. Rava said the standard shir is a koimitz, which is shnei zeisim. Thus kol sa'ar is being marba even a kazayis. But l'chayr it's machlokes Abaye v'Rava if you be chayav for a kolshu. Abaye holds pachas mikazayis even a kolshu. Rava says it has to be at the very least a kazayis. We know the rule. Whenever there's a machlokes Abaye v'Rava, with 6 exceptions, the Yal Kagam, the halacha is always like Rava. So Freik the Kesef Mishnah, it's a Timir Gedoyla by me. I don't understand Poshim Shan and the Rambam. How is it possible that the Rambam learned a sugya in Masechtes Menachos, Daf Nun Ches, and he saw Machlokes Abaye v'Rav, and he passed him like Abaye? Everybody knows the rule. Every child that learned Elam Mitzias knows whenever there's a Machlokes Abaye v'Rav, the halacha is like Rava. The halacha is not like Abaye. At first glance, Divrei HaRambam is Tzrichen Iyun Gadol. The Lechem Mishnah right here on this Rambam sends you to another Rambam. He says, take a look at the Rambam in Hilchas Maaseh HaKorbanos, Perek Yud Gimel Halach Yudal. The Rambam over there says, "Ein koimitz pachos mikashnei zeisim." Rambam says that the shir koimitz has to be pachos at the very least shnei zeisim. Umixas hakoimitz ma'akev eskulei. We learned these halachas. A koimitz can't be chaser, it can't be yaser. It has to be the full shir. In other words, the Rambam paskins that the shir koimitz is shnei zeisim, which is shitas Rava in the sugya of Menachos, Daf Nun Ches. It's right the Lechem Mishnah, it's a stiris HaRambam. Here the Rambam in Perekei, Hilchas Yisurei Mizbeach, Halacha Aleph, it sounds like a Bar Mitzvah Pshatel, holds that what's the shir of Kol Sa'ar v'Chol Devash, that the pasuk is Marba, is Afilu b'Kol Shul. That's shitas Abaya. Abaya who held that the shir koimitz is Pachas Mishnei Zeisim. So when we're Marba half of that, it's Pachas Mikazai. But Rava, who holds that Ein Koimetz Pachas Mishnei Zeisim, held that the ribuy of Kol Sa'ar is only a Kazayas. And the Rambam is hanging onto this rope from both sides. The Rambam is passing like Rava and Hilchas Maaseh HaKorbanos, Perek Gimel Halach Yudalid, Ein Koimetz Pachas Mishnei Zeisim. And yet the Rambam paskins like Abaya in Cheshbon and Hilchos Yisurim Mizbech, Perek Halacha Aleph, where the Rambam says that if someone's over the Isser Sa'ar, Afilu b'mashahu, he's going to be over. Says the Lechem Mishnah from my kasha, which is the Stiris HaRambam, and the Kesef Mishnah's kasha, which is how could the Rambam paskin like Abaya? It's very clear to me what the Shitz Rambam is. The Rambam paskin like Rava. The Rambam held that ain't koimetz pachas mikoshnei zeis, and it's for that reason when the pasuk's marba ki chol sar v'chol davash will be marba only a kazayas, and that's why the Rambam in Ma'aser Karbonos Perek Gimel Halach Yudal said clearly ain't koimetz pachas mikoshnei zeis, because we always paskin like Rava. Hilchos HaKavasi de Rava levar miyal kegam. The Rambam in Hilchos Yisurim Mizbech Perek Halacha Aleph. What did the Rambam say? Sa'aru dvash asurim legabi hamizbech v'isurim b'kolshe. All the Rambam says is that it's aser. You know why it's aser? Because we know there's machlekes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish in Yumadaf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis Ayin Dal Amud Aleph, whether Chatzi Shir is aser min HaTorah or Chatzi Shir is mutar min HaTorah. And the Rambam Kiyadua pasuk like Rabbi Yochanan that Chatzi Shir is aser min HaTorah. The reason the Rambam held that you're going to be chayiv even for a kolshu of Sa'ar is not because that's the shir that was Nisraba in Kol Sa'ar. It's not the shir that was Nisraba in Kol Sa'ar. That shir is a kazayas, like Rava says in the Gemara, like the Rambam himself pasuk like Rava in the end of the 13th parak in Hilchos Ma'aser Karbonos. The reason the Rambam said it's aser b'kolshu because the Rambam l'shitosle holds chassid shir aser min HaTorah. So less than a kazayas of Sa'or on the Mizbeach is like Gar from any other Chatzi Shir, which is also in HaTorah. In other words, when the pasuk was Marba Chatzi Shir, the sugi that we learned this morning, Menachos Daf Nun Ches, that sugi was coming to say that if somebody's makter a Chatzi Shir, it's if he was makter a Shir. L'mayin Afkamin is going to get Malkus. But Avada Gevist, if you're makter less than that, it's like Gar from any other area in halacha. We have Rabbi Yochanan's halacha of Chatzi Shir Asam Min HaTorah. Nafkamina is whether you're going to be punished for it. Rabbi Yochanan's halacha of Chatzi Shir Asam Min HaTorah is only regarding the Issa. There's not going to be Malkus. Whether there's a Mefurish Issa or an Issa that's learned out from a drasha, for that there's going to be Malkus. The Rambam never said you're going to get Malkus in Perek Halacha Aleph. Time is the Lechem Mishnah. The Rambam just said So'iru Dvash Asurim Legabe HaMizbeach V'Yisurim B'Kolshu. The Rambam never said Malkus. The Rambam meant al Chatzi Shir. Of course, the Rambam paskins like Rava V'Hakol Yavoy El Mekoymoi Bashalim. Azoy the Lechem Mishnah. Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah Kuf Yud Zayin brings the Rambams. He brings the Kesef Mishnah's Kasha, the Lechem Mishnah's Teretz, and says the Minchas Chinuch, if you think about it, if you put it all together and look at it now, l'chayr, what you have is a shver Kesef Mishnah. Because I think, says the Minchas Chinuch, that the Lechem Mishnah's Teretz is Pasha. Of course that's what the Rambam meant. The Rambam said, Asa v'kolshu, the same way the Rambam said, you're not allowed to steal a kolshu, even though we know there's a shir of Pruta. But like the Magen Mishnah says, because Chatzi Shir is Asa min HaTorah. There's so many places where the Rambam says, Isurim b'kolshu. And the Bir Advarim is, Chatzi Shir Asa min HaTorah. So Freik the Minchas Chinuch on the Kesef Mishnah, he says to me, the Lechem Mishnah's Teretz is so Pasha. And how else do you answer the Stiris HaRambam? Of course the Rambam meant Chatzi Shir Asam Min HaTorah. So he says, Sarachin, why did the Kesef Mishnah not learn Pashup Pshat? Says the Minchas Chinuch, I think Pshat in the Kesef Mishnah is Hafla V'Fela, based on the Chakira HaYodua of the Shagas Aryeh. The Gemara in Masechtas Yuma Daf Ayin Daled, when the Gemara brings Rabbi Yochanan's Shita, so Rabbi Yochanan's halach is learned out from a pasuk. It says Kol Chaylev LeRabbi's Chatzi Shir, but the Gemara then brings a svara, and the Gemara says that really there's an underlying svara to Shitas Rabbi Yochanan. And what's the svara? Says the Gemara, Kivan dechazi le'itzdarufe Isura ka'achel. Being that after a person eats a chatzi shir of machalas asuras, let's say chaylev, it's chazi letzdarufe. And pashup shat, what the Gemara means is you can eat another chatzi shir, and that would somehow be mitzdarif to the original chatzi shir that I ate and create a shir of iser. It's for that reason that chatzi shir is asam min HaTorah. And pashup shat in this Gemara is the way we just explained it. And that is that we know that whenever there's a halacha of machalas asuros, or there's a mitzvah sachila, so for example, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah below Pesach. So how much is the shir kazayis? It doesn't mean you have to take a kazayis, stuff it in your mouth, and swallow it b'neshima achas, the way you say aseres b'nei haman. That's not what it means. What it means is you have to eat it within a shir. What's the shir? B'chtei achilas pras. 2 minutes, 9 minutes, whatever the shir is. But you have to eat it within a certain amount of time. And even though over a several minute period of time, it's going to come out, you're doing several achilos. There's a chiddush in the halachos of achilos, whether it's achilos mitzvah or whether it's machalos asuros, that many achilos, although they're different maises, are mitztaref to create one achila as long as they happen within a certain time frame. As long as they happen, b'chtei achilas pras. That means if somebody would eat a chatzi shir of macholas asuros, and then 5 minutes later would eat another chatzi shir of macholas asuros, it'd be nesparer l'mafreya that the first chatzi shir that he ate was really an achilas isser. Because even though at the time that he ate it, he didn't eat the shir, but whoever had over after he ate the other half, that this achila was mitzdaref to another achila, and it comes out that both achilas were also. So Pashup Shah, what the Gemara is saying is, Rabbi Yochanan says, Avad, there's something called a shir. And when the Torah says you're not allowed to eat chaylev, it means don't eat a kazayas. But if you eat a chatzi shir, it's going to be awesome in a Torah. You know why? Because it's chazil let's tarufe. Because what would happen if you go now and you eat another half of zayas? If you eat another half of zayas, it's going to be nisbarer lemafreya that the first half that you ate was Isser. Thus, here's the chiddush, here's the leap of faith. Even if you don't eat the second half, the first half becomes Aser. It becomes Aser because theoretically, if you would eat the other half, it would come out the mafreya that the first half that I ate was Aser. Thus, it's what we view as Chazi Litzarufi. The truth is, the Achronim Mutsha, they don't understand it 100%. I saw that Rav Shlomo HaKoyim Vilna, the Cheshik Shlomo, in his Binyan Shlomo, Siman Mem Aleph, there's a beautiful Siman regarding the halachas of Chatzi Shir. And he says, well, what's Pashup Pshat in this? Pshat is that after you eat a half a shir, we're concerned that you might eat another half, so therefore we tell you don't eat half. Meaning it's like that's the way he understood it. Don't eat half, because you could always eat another half. It's going to be chazi litzdarufe. Thus, we don't want you to eat a half. He says that it's only a suffix if you're going to eat the other half after you eat the first half. So why would we mean chayish l'sveika? And he makes a totally in the Rambam Shita. I mean, this is classic pilpul. That holds that sveika deiraisa l'chumra is only midrabanan. Ayin sham dvarim the floor madlamay. But that's the pashup pshat in the halach of chatzis shirasim and atayr. It's based on a svara. It's a lashon hagemara Talmud Bavli Yuma Ayin Dalar and Aleph. It's based on chazil etzdarufe. And pashup pshat is that even though chatzis shir in and of itself is not iser, but being that it could be mitzdaref toichdei achilas pras, therefore even the Chatzi Shir itself becomes Aser. But the Shagasarye, in the Sefer Shagasarye, Siman Pei Aleph, was Megala to the yeshiva world, another way to learn this Gemara. The Shagasarye said maybe that's not what the Gemara means. Maybe the Gemara doesn't mean anything so lamnish. All the Gemara means is at the end of the day, the Torah says don't eat chaylev, you ate chaylev. You did what the Torah said you're not supposed to do. Narvas, you didn't eat the shir. No, the shir was chazi letzdarufe. Not right now you could be mitzdaref to the shir. You could have, would have, should have been mitzdaref to the shir. This is something you could have possibly done. Instead of eating a half a zayis, you could have eaten a whole zayis. And had you eaten a whole zayis, you would have been over. So even if you eat less than a kazayis, that is in and of itself going to be an isser. Chazi letzdarufe, not right now, but chazi letzdarufe means that I could have eaten more. Meaning, all I'm missing is, it's starfus. I'm missing a little shear. If all I'm missing is shear, that's not enough for it to be awesome. In other words, yesh lachker, what's the yisoid of chazilat starufe, which the Gemara says is the svara that underpins Shitas Rabbi Yochanan Chatzi Shirasim Atayr? Doesn't mean that after I ate the half a shear, right now I could eat another half, which would make what I ate lemafrei, or that's not what it means. It means that when I ate, I could have eaten more, and being that I could have eaten more, and that would have been the Isser, even though I did anymore, even though there's nothing I could do right now to be masakin it, so to speak. It doesn't matter. That in and of itself is going to be awesome. Said the Shagasari, what would be the nafkamina between these two tzladim? Now, nafkamina would be, what if you're dealing with an Isser where you don't have the chiddush of chazi litzdarufe b'shir k'dei achilas pras? And the context Shagasari is in Hilchas Chometz, he was discussing the loisaseh of Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh. Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh also has a shir. And the question is, what would be chatzi shir? If somebody has a chatzi shir of Chometz on Pesach, is there going to be a chatzi shir asim and atayra, or is there not going to be a chatzi shir asim and atayra? Said the Shagasari, it's totally in these two tzladim. If Chatzi Shir Asim and Atayr is because Bepoil, after you did Chatzi Shir, I could be mitzdaref another half a shir. That's true when it comes to Machalas Asuros, where there's a halacha that b'chtei achilas pras to achilas ha-mitzdaref. But by Rabbi Yimatz, you don't have that chiddush. Although the Minchas Chinuch wonders out loud why, but it ain't common koimai. But that's what the Shagasari assumed as a hanacha. The Shagasari assumed that if you would be masha half a shir, and then a day later you would have another half a shir, there's nothing to be mitzdaref them. So you don't have the chazil starufe. Then chatzi shir won't be asim and atayr by Rabbi Yimatz. But if chazil starufe doesn't mean that right now I can make them be mitzdaref. But rather what it means is that I could have, would have, should have. Then by Rabbi Yimatz also I could have had more share. So for that reason you'd have chatzi shir asim and atayr by Rabbi Yimatz as well. It says it's to answer the Pnei Yishu's kasha be'er dav zayin v'advar v'atikin. Bottom line, Zok the Minchas Chinuch, that could be the machloikis between the Kesef Mishnah and the Lechem Mishnah. Whether the Rambam who says that the loisa say of kol sar v'chol d'dvash is also b'mashu means chashi shir is totally in these two stadim of the Shagas Aryeh. Because what's the context over here in our sugya? We're discussing a lav of haktorah. We're not discussing achila. We're discussing haktorah. Ki chol sa'ar v'chol d'vash loisa ktiru mimenu yishal Hashem. Zok to Menachos chinuch, it's pashut. There's no one that's going to tell you that two haktorahs pachas mikashir b'ktei achilas pras are going to be mitzdarif. That's a shir in achila. That's not a shir in haktorah. Although, parenthetically, being that haktorah is always referred to as achilas mizbeach, I think it's fair to wonder why it was so pashut to the Menachos chinuch. Maybe haktorah is also viewed as an achila because it's called it. You see, there's so many halachas of achilas that permeate. Right? You have the halacha mimashki Yisrael. You can only put kosher food on them. But you see, there's halachas. This hilchas achilos that do relate to haktorah because the Torah calls it as achila. So maybe you do have the halacha of chazil et staruf, but the Menachos chinuch assume for sure not. There's no halacha of chazil et staruf. If that's the case, hot peinach, if you're going to assume that pshat and the way chazil et staruf works is that you could have been married in this year. So by haktorah you also could have been married in this year. Thus you'd have the halacha of chatzis shir asam and haktorah by haktorah. But maybe the Kesef Mishnah understood pashuv pshat in the way chatzis shir asam and haktorah works. Not like the mechudish to get tzad in the Shagas Aryeh. But the way it works is that after I eat a half a shir, I could be moisef another half a shir. By haktorah, that's not true. After I'm makter chatzi shir, I can't be makter a chatzi shir and be mitzdaref into the first chatzi. What's mitzdaref to two haktorahs? By achila, you have the chiddush of tei achilas pras, but you don't have that chiddush by haktorah. So there's nothing to be mitzdaref. If there's nothing to be mitzdaref, in other words, the lechem mishnah who assumed for a double pasha that the Rambam means chatzi shir, that only works, says the Menachos chinuch, with the tzada mechudeshes of the Shagas Aryeh. You don't need a chazil l'tzdarufe in order to have chatzis shir asam and atayra. Chazil l'tzdarufe just means you could have had more originally. Thus it relates to all these surah. If that's the case, it should relate to chol sar v'chol d'vash lo yisak tiru mani yishal Hashem. That's why the Lechem Mishnah came with a self-confidence. He says, I'll tell you pshat in the Rambam. Rambam paskin like Rava. I in Hilchas Yisur Mizbeach chatzis shir asam and atayra. I the Kesef Mishnah zok Menachos chinuch because he understood pashuv pshat in the Gemara Yuma Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. Kesef Mishnah is the pashtus. Chazil l'tzdarufe means that you need a poil to be able to be mitzdaref. So if that's what it means, l'chari you don't have it. It's for that reason the Kesef Mishnah didn't want to give the Lechem Mishnah's teretz. Ad kan divrei ha-Menachos chinuch. But just to add to this pilpul one ha'ara, and that is there's another Rambam. The Rambam is in Hilchas Chametz U'Matzah, Perek Aleph, Halacha Zayin. The Rambam says ha'oicho min ha-chometz atzmai bepesach kolshu. If somebody eats a kolshu of chometz on Pesach, hareza asam in ha-Torah. Shenemar lo yiyachel chametz. So says the Rambam, if somebody eats a kolshu of chametz on Pesach, it's a problem. How do I know that? It's a pasuk in the Torah. It says lo yiyachel chametz, and that's somehow marba chametz b'mashu. V'afal pishe again, any chayiv koros like carbon elakship. There's no einish on it. There's no carbon for that. You need a kazayas. But at the same time, if somebody eats pachas mikashir, even though there's no einish, says the Rambam, it's still going to be awesome in Torah. Why is it going to be awesome in Torah? Because it says in the Torah lo yachal chametz. Freik the Kesef Mishnah on this Rambam. Kashali lamali krab chametz bepesach. Why do I need a pasuk lo yachal chametz to tell me that you're not allowed to eat a mashu of chametz? Habechal yisurim shebetorah kaimalan chatzis shir awesome in Torah. As I freak the Kesef Mishnah, and he bleibt sarchi. He says, I don't understand Pashup Shat. The Noda B'Yehuda in his Tzlach in Mesechtes Psachim Daf Mem Daled, and he talks about it in the tshuva because a shoyol asked him a shayla on the tzlach, and the Noda B'Yehuda starts the tshuva kedarka with a little color, and the Yehuda tells him, "Thank you so much for going through my sefer. I really appreciate it." He was asking him ma'ara on this teretz that the Noda B'Yehuda wrote in his tzlach to answer the Kesef Mishnah kasha. So the Noda B'Yehuda, I'll tell you a very posh the teretz. You know what the teretz is? The whole reason that chatzis shir is awesome and not Torah, the Gemara says Yuma Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph is because it's chazil it's darufe. It means because after I eat a chatzis shir, I could always eat another chatzis shir. What would be if a person eats a mashu of Pesach, achron shel Pesach, right as the sun is setting? It's Rabbeinu Tam Shkia. As the sun is setting, it's Shkia l'chol days. At that point, you would eat a chatzis shir. Zogt the Noda B'Yehuda that out the halacha of chatzis shir asam and atayra wouldn't be asam, because chatzis shir asam and atayra is predicated on Chazi Litztarufe, and there's no Chazi Litztarufe. Because how in the world are you going to be mitzdarefet? There's going to be no way to be mitzdarefet. So Zok to Rabbi Yehuda is very geschmack. Kesef Mishnah didn't understand why the Rambam needed a pasuk. I'll tell you why I needed a pasuk. Not for a classic case. Somebody on the third day Cholamoid decides that he wants to eat a chatzis. You don't need a pasuk for that, because the pasuk anyways doesn't teach you an einish, and without an einish, I know it's also because the Rambam pasuk is like Rabbi Yochanan. Chatzis also in Torah. Oh, but it's a chaptzach and nafkamina. Nafkamina would be if a person would eat it literally Achron Shal Pesach as the sun is setting. Over there, if you would eat the chatzis, there'd be no way to be mitzdaref the other half, because the other half already is showing matzah yontif. You're making abdal already. It's too late. As a result, it wouldn't be shaykh the chazi litztarufe. That's his teretz. Emma says this chiddush that Rabbi Yehuda's before in a tshuva Reb Kiva Eger. Reb Kiva Eger at the end of a tshuva, it's tshuva kuf nun dalet. He says this chiddush, or at least he wonders out loud whether this would be true. He says v'ula yesh loyma the had the chatzis shir aser hainu ba'odsha iser be'en bekazayis b'zeh shaykh chazi litztarufe l'shir shalim. It has to be possible to do it. Ava ba'achle the shayr chatzis shir the lekah shir ba'olam. Let's say you don't have the half in the world. It doesn't exist. V'lo shaykh chazi litztarufe. So Reb Kiva Eger wanted to say no, maybe mutal oichloi. V'yeh mizeh din chodesh says the Minchas Chinuch. Says the Reb Kiva Eger. The besoif yoyim achrin the Pesach. At the end of Achron Shal Pesach, Yosef Yom Kippurin, the Inyan the Lekah Shas Lechol Kazayis, Yemut the Lechol Chatzis Shir, V'tzarachin Ladin. But Al Kapanim, it's also in Rabbi Yehuda. Reb Kiva Eger, Rabbi Yehuda Shneim Nischavnu L'Davar Echad. Reb Kiva Eger saying it in the context of his tshuva. Rabbi Yehuda said it in Tzlach to answer the Kesef Mishnah Kasha. So I was thinking at first glance, what would be Pashim Shan in the Kesef Mishnah? Maybe the Kesef Mishnah held like the other side. Meaning the Rabbi Yehuda's teretz is predicated on Chazil Tzarufin, means that you bepoil need to go ahead and be mitzdaref. You need a bepoil, be mitzdaref. You need to be mitzdarefit. Thus, it's not shaykh to be mitzdarefit if you do ba'achron shal Pesach. So it's not shaykh to be mitzdarefit. You're not going to have chatzis shir asim and Torah. But that's really only one side in the Shagas Aryas Chakir and Simon Samach Aleph had to understand, and Simon Pei Aleph had to understand chatzis shir asim and Torah. The Shagas Aryas had another side. The other side in the Shagas Aryas was that what? That Chazal Starufi doesn't mean that right now I could be mitzdaref, but it's more what I could have done. And as long as I could have been mitzdaref, that's why you have Chatzi Shir, says the Shagasai, maybe by Bayirah, by Yamatzah. That's why the Minchas Chinuch says you'd have Chatzi Shir, like the Lechem Mishnah, with regards to the Isra of Kichol, Savachol, Davash, Leisakir, even though there's no Shir mitzdaref. There's nothing to be mitzdaref at all after I did it. It's not what I could do now, it's what I could have done. It's like Bazayt Kavaldik. You know why the Kesef Mishnah didn't want to answer like the Noida Behuda? Because the Noida Behuda's teretz assumes that you need Chazil maybe the Kesef Mishnah held you don't need Chazil Tzaruf B'Poil. And I found in the new Reb Kiva Egers, in the Hamar, it's Cheluk Beis incidentally, but in the new Reb Kiva Egers on the bottom, so they bring here that seems to be the way the Achreinim want to explain why the Kesef Mishnah didn't understand the Noida Behuda, didn't learn like the Noida Behuda. That the reason he didn't learn like the Noida Behuda because he held like the Chudish Tegetzad in the Shagas Aryeh. But that's all good before this morning, before this Topol. The problem is that if that's the case, we have a steer in the Kesef Mishnah. Because the Minchas Chinuch was Mechiach from the Kesef Mishnah in Perikei Halacha Aleph and the Chesed Mizbeach. That he bleibt schwer. Why the Rambam paskins that Kichol Savachol Davash Yichayiv even b'Mashu? The isn't that a Abaya Shita? Tainet Lechem Mishnah. How did the Rambam paskins like Rava? The Rambam never said you get Malchus. All the Rambam says it's also. He meant because Chatzi Shir is also not Torah. So to Minchas Chinuch, you know why the Kesef Mishnah didn't want to learn like the Lechem Mishnah? He didn't like the Lechem Mishnah because he held that you needed to be Chazil Tzarufei and you need bepoil Chazil Tzarufei. And over here you don't have bepoil Tzarufei. If he held like that side that you need bepoil Tzarufei, they could have very simply answered his kasha in Perak Aleph Hilchas Chametz U'Matzah like the Noida Behuda. From the fact that he didn't want to answer like the Noida Behuda, it's mashma he held that you don't need that at bepoil. So the question that we're left with is Vos halt the Kesef Mishnah. The Chayr, we have a steer in the Kesef Mishnah. We have a Kesef Mishnah in Perak Aleph Hilchas Chametz U'Mashma, which is mashma like one side in the Shagas Aryeh. We have a Kesef Mishnah in Perak Hey in Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach. That's mashma like another side in the Shagas Aryeh. Also have a Shabbos Hagadol drasha, but either way, we'll leave it at this.